One of the most significant events in Protestant Christianity in the first half of the 20th century is the Fundamentalist-Modernist controversy. This is really introduces a schism between branches of Protestantism and the effects of which are still felt to this day. The Fundamentalist-Modernist controversy is also in itself representative of the ways in which modernity itself shapes Christianity. So let's just kind of review some trajectories here. We have 19th century Protestant evangelicalism. It's a diverse movement. It spreads across multiple denominations. It contains multiple perspectives within it. What we have happen is that there's a threefold fracturing of evangelicalism. One branch goes into what we call the modernism direction, which develops into what we call mainline Protestantism today. The five major mainline Protestant churches are the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the Disciples of Christ, and a sixth one, the American Baptist Convention. So that's an important kind of nexus of a group that we call mainline Protestantism. Another group moves into what we call fundamentalism, and that has a later trajectory of one that stays as kind of a fundamentalist separatist movement, and another that develops into what we call evangelicalism, or some scholars call it neo-evangelicalism, that we see a figure like Billy Graham in the post-World War II period representing. And then finally, there's a section of evangelicalism that develops into what we call Pentecostalism, and we'll discuss that in more detail in a follow-up video. So it's important to define fundamentalism in this context. It is a coalition of conservative Protestants theologically, who oppose shifts in primarily northern denominations based in places like New York City, Chicago. It's city-based, that is, it's not primarily rural. Often people in the United States associate fundamentalism with a rural expression of Christianity, but actually fundamentalism in its origins is urban. So Chicago, where the Moody Bible Institute is, for instance, is very prominent. Los Angeles, where Fuller Theological Seminary is important. And New York City. Those are all three key areas of early fundamentalism. It's also transatlantic. Fundamentalism is also developing a parallel process in the United Kingdom. There's significant developments in Canada, and there's also significant developments in Latin America, especially in Mexico. And it is interdenominational. That is, fundamentalists share their perspectives across a variety of denominational boundaries. Fundamentalism really emerges as two things happen. Historical biblical criticism begins to emerge more, and a variety of denominational standards are loosened. So an example of this is with the Presbyterian Church USA, which was Northern Presbyterians. In 1903, they begin to revise the Westminster Confession, which is the historic statement of faith for Anglophone Presbyterians, to soften some of its Calvinist stances in order to facilitate a merger with the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, which was based primarily in Kentucky. This upset over both the revision of the Westminster Confession and the teaching of historical biblical criticism in some Presbyterian seminaries, especially at Princeton Theological Seminary, led to this creation of an alliance of conservative Presbyterians at the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly in 1910, and they approve this resolution about the so-called five fundamentals. So they say, Christian faith rests on 5 fundamentals. These are the inerrancy of Scripture. That is, Scripture contains no error, which is different than a doctrine of the inspiration of Scripture, which would teach that the Scripture is inspired to teach that which God intends. This then inerrancy of Scripture requires then a literal interpretation of Scripture. So something like the doctrine of creation has emphasized a 7-day literal doctrine of creation for an inerrant perspective, rather than an inspiration perspective of Scripture would say, what's being taught about the 7 days of creation is something about God's desire for the world to exist in goodness. The second fundamental is the virgin birth. Jesus Christ was literally born of a virgin. One of the things that's happening in the early 20th century is a lot of debate about the virgin birth because of questions about how it aligns with science and human biology. Third, substitutionary atonement. That is this very particular understanding of atonement as being Christ's substitutionary death on the cross for sinners is the only acceptable doctrine of atonement. As we've examined in this class, multiple theories of atonement exist, and Christians have faithfully argued for a variety of them. Fundamentalism says there's only one acceptable version. The fourth fundamental is emphasizing the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, that Jesus Christ's resurrection is not simply a metaphor about God's love for humanity, but physically actually happens. Again, in this point in time, in the early 20th century, there's intense debate about how one ought to teach and interpret the bodily resurrection of Jesus in light of science. And finally, the fifth fundamental is the historical reality of Christ's miracles. That is, when Christ feeds the 5,000, he literally feeds the 5,000. Again, it's not a metaphor for the power of generosity or the transforming nature of community. Again, this is a response to questions around how to read Scripture in light of science. These 5 fundamentals become a rallying point for theological conservatives and help boost this transatlantic movement. So there's a series of books published between 1910 and 1915, overseen by Lyman Stewart, who's a prominent member of the fundamentalist movement, called The Fundamentals. And so we can see how the name comes from the founding documents here. There's nothing in the 5 fundamentals that is necessarily outside the boundaries of historic Christianity, but the ways in which it emphasizes a very narrow and particular interpretation of these elements is what is new. So especially as a reaction against science itself. There's also a critique in here of the social gospel movement and this notion that redemption happens on a social scale. The fundamentalist movement chooses to not be involved in social movements and to argue for public morality improving only once individuals are saved. The more Christians you have, the more moral your society will be. You don't need to have a mass movement trying to deal with labor exploitation. Sin abounds, and you'll never be able to deal with those kinds of social sins unless everyone becomes a Christian first. So a real stepping away from social involvement and emphasizing personal morality, which is very different than the earlier evangelical movement, like with abolitionism, that saw personal faith as being expressed in social movements. Now, in part as this response to modernity, where there's a hierarchy and a bifurcation of zones. So you have faith here, that's personal, private, and public life over here, which is separate from faith. That bifurcation that modernity is doing was really unknown to the abolitionists only half a century before. Another key marker of fundamentalism is something called dispensationalist premillennialism. This is a way of thinking about end times or eschatology. Dispensationalism refers to the notion that there's distinct eras of time, or what we call dispensations. So Augustine in City of God introduces the notion of dispensations when he talks about 7 ages of the world. But the way that fundamentalists use the notion of dispensationalism is to use it in a way that says God determines these eras of time. And really, humanity has nothing to do with the shifting of eras. So it's very anti-developmental. It's a very anti-naturalistic way of explaining historical change. Historical change doesn't happen via human agency. Only divine agency changes eras. And in this very kind of anti-scientific, anti-historical way of arguing, then history is divided into 7 dispensations. Each of them represents a change in how God deals with humanity in sort of a new test that humanity has to either pass or fail. And guess what? They usually fail. When humans fail these tests, the dispensation ends in judgment and catastrophe, and then the next dispensation begins. So, just to review, here are our dispensations. The first dispensation is the dispensation of innocence that ends, so that's Eden, creation, that ends with the fall of humanity, Adam and Eve's sin. Then it's the dispensation of conscience, where humans begin to learn right from wrong. Cain and Abel begins it. It ends with the flood. Humans fail the test of conscience. Then is the dispensation of human government, where people after the flood begin to reorganize society. This comes to an end with the Tower of Babel. Then's the dispensation of the promise that God will hear the cries of his people with Abraham. This ends with bondage in Egypt. The catastrophe here is Joseph being sold into slavery. Then we have the Exodus, the dispensation of the law, which ends with the death of Jesus Christ. The church is presently in the dispensation of grace, which will end in a period of tribulation with the reign of Antichrist, immediately followed by Christ's return to earth and a victory with a battle at Armageddon. That whole narrative I just gave you might be familiar with those who are familiar with fundamentalist end time scenarios. And then the final dispensation is the 7th one, which is the millennium, the personal reign of Christ. After the millennium is a new heavens and the new earth of eternity. This reading of the dispensations of humanity is developed and popularized in 1909 with the publication of the Scofield Reference Bible by Cyrus Scofield, in which there's various notations throughout the Bible explaining this very elaborate series of dispensations that leads towards this reading of history. I want to emphasize a few things. One is that there's nothing obvious about this way of reading history. That especially this notion of this dispensation of grace that ends with a period of tribulation and Christ's return to earth. This is all based on very particular readings of portions of the book of Revelation, 1 Thessalonians, Gospel of Mark, and the book of Daniel that are thrown together and create this roadmap of an end time scenario. The church historically did not read Revelation this way. This reading of this pre-millennial dispensationalism is an invention itself of modernity. As this way of reading the Bible, interpreting it, is clearly a modern way of reading it that has no obvious predecessors. It is a response to anxieties about society, about whether or not humanity is progressing or not. It becomes massively popular in the 20th century because of the catastrophes of World War I, World War II, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the terrors of authoritarian totalitarianism. So it comes out of a response to what modernity itself is doing that might not be an inherent reading of Scripture itself. But because this reading is so popular now in certain segments of American Protestantism, it's very important to be aware of its origins and its history. In our next video, we're going to go into more detail with thinking about the fundamentalist-modernist split.